many more excellent questions than we will have time for. It is almost 8 o'clock, and I know that the hour is going to go by very rapidly. I appreciate every one of you who put your thought and energy into these questions.
People have asked me what this picture is on the screen. This is another, Paul, of De Palma's experiments. To me, it's the most extraordinary experiment because it goes to the heart of a mystery that you and I love, which is the Cambrian explosion. What Bruce did was to plant some ordinary lawn grass in a tin pie plate over a rotating turntable. Ordinary 78 RPM turntable. You can actually see the tone arm behind the grass there. And what he did was to have the grass over a rotating turntable, that's this one, and a control group of grass over a non-rotating turntable. And what he found, again to his amazement, was that the grass over the rotating turntable grew higher, faster than the grass over the non-rotating turntable. Again, no physical connection. And when I saw this, there was like a little bell went off, and I said to myself, okay, we've got spinning balls, we've got rotating masses, we have anomalous physical space-time effects, and now we can clearly see on the right, the grass is healthier, higher, etc. than the grass on the left. Rotating on the right, non-rotating on the left. Grass is not rotating, the turntable under the cardboard that the pan sits in is doing the rotating. If this field, if this gate opened up by rotation is doing something physically, it's equally fascinatingly doing something biologically, because the Earth is a spinning system. And the biggest mystery that you and I know about is why at the Cambrian boundary we went from little simple guys to literally overnight. I think your Japanese friend compared it to 1 minute in a 24-hour day, to an explosion of all the life forms on this planet. Our model says that what in effect we are seeing is the physics of rotation and a hyperdimensional connection having an interface with the world of biology on this planet. And if it happened on this planet, then the question is, what was the change? What happened in the Cambrian to make the Earth go from a non-biological friendly place to a biologically extraordinary place that produced, in essence, this? This is the standard diagram. There's the boundary and the geological strata. Below, there's almost nothing, as you know. Above, there's everything, as you know. And it's like it was turned on like flicking a switch. My contention is that in this physics lies the answer to this mystery, and it is not just between Darwinianism or design, but there's a possible third alternative involving the pursuit of a new physics.
As you're probably well aware, there were snowball events right up until the Cambrian explosion.
Well, there's a model of snowball events.
Well, we know there's at least 2 snowballs, maybe 5, that just predated the Cambrian explosion. And there'd be good reasons from a creator's perspective to wait until the snowball phase is over before you have this explosion of life.
Why not make life that would be adapted to a snowball Earth?
Well, there was life during the snowball era.
Why would a creator, an infinite creator, God, decide to wait to the, quote, appropriate time when he can define the parameters?
Okay, I gave a little bit of this in my talk, how you have the problem of these vital poisons. I didn't mention the cryptogamic crusts, which prepare the soil for vascular plant. But these cryptogamic colonies and these sulfate-reducing bacteria must operate in the context of the dimensions of the Earth for a considerable period of time before the environment is ready for the Cambrian explosion.
It's like the gardener preparing the garden.
Exactly. I mean, these vital poisons would have killed these Cambrian animals if they were created too soon. The vascular plants wouldn't have survived if they were created too soon. So the planet was carefully prepared by the Creator.
But why, if we're dealing with a creative process, fiat lux, why does it have to be a time scale at all in 3 dimensions? Why isn't it instantly?
Well, it could have been instantaneous if you have different physics, but given the physics of the universe, this is the way.
The supernatural contravenes the physics. You
Well-
mean God is basically a captive of his own model?
Well, okay, I think any good model has to address questions: how would the Creator do it? Or if you're going to be a non-creationist, you'd say, why would evolution do it this way, or how would evolution work? But it's more important, I believe, to address the why questions. Why would a Creator choose this scenario we see played out in the fossil record? And one of the things we've been working on at Reasons to Believe is that we see design in the universe, physical design, to prepare a home for humanity. And that ideal design to provide a home for humanity happens to be identical to the best design to provide us with a viewing platform. I didn't get into this in my talk, but what astronomers now recognize is almost everywhere else you go in the universe, you wouldn't see the universe. It would be blocked from view. Almost anywhere you go out in our galaxy, your view would be blocked. There's only a very tiny percentage of the stars where you even be able to tell you live in a galaxy. However, the best design to provide us with a habitat is identical to the best design to provide us with a viewing platform so we can see all this design.
It's a God after my own heart. I love a view.
Okay. It's also identical to the best design of the physics of the universe to motivate us to turn from evil and to pursue virtue. If you look at every law and constants of physics, you'll see that, and you actually see this alluded to in Genesis 3, that, when Adam and Eve rebelled against God's authority, from that point onward, they were going to suffer more work and more pain in proportion to the evil that they would allow to enter into their system. But as you go through all the laws and constants of physics, you can see that they've been optimally designed to provide humanity with the maximum motivation. Now, I would argue the fact that those 3 ideal design conditions are identical to one another is powerful evidence that there's a really wise Creator there that has ahead of time worked out a plan. And therefore, I look at, say, the 3.8 billion years of past Earth history and say, does all this fit in the context of God wanting to build a universe to provide us with a home and an ideal viewing platform that would provide us with the best theater for the efficient conquest of evil through the work of Jesus Christ?
I'd like to break in at this point because you all are answering questions that have been put in this stack here, and I've appreciated that very much. And one of the questions that you're touching on is what is each of your own personal faith or your own personal beliefs in terms of who created or guided or superintended the processes. Why are humans here on Earth? That question came up numerous times of folks wanting clarity from each of you of where are you coming from? That's the kind of question I was getting. So Richard, if you'd like to give a quick summary for yourself and give the opportunity to each person to give that summary.
Okay. Somebody wants to know, a lot of people want to know my faith.
Yep.
Well, I was a Roman Catholic because of my parents and family and whatever for many, many years. And I asked too many questions, and now I'm a recovering Roman Catholic.
Wisconsinites can appreciate that. Yeah.
But I still ask questions. And I don't I very deliberately put the quote from Genesis regarding man and his image. By the way, the cool quote is image and likeness, which I found fascinating because the image part refers to the superficial. The likeness part is the essence of God. The two are clearly separate. And that's a long discussion. I don't want to get sidetracked here. But
in that verse, they're separate, but they're actually flipped in other verses, so they're interchangeable.
Okay.
But you're right, it's a long debate.
Yeah. My point is that when I put that quote up, backed by Gaylord Simpson's quote, It was because a lot of science, to me, has the same problems that being a Catholic had. You were basically told to be a good boy, sit down, shut up, and stop asking those stupid questions. And I like asking questions of everybody. So that's where I'm coming from. I want truth, and I don't want to have it handed to me by an authority.
And Richard,
I want a process.
would you be willing to say what you believe?
I don't think that a humanoid face on Mars can possibly exist there without some connection to us. That's why I'm so excited by what David has done, because he's put flesh on the bones. He has mapped out this extraordinary, exquisitely complex, and logically consistent scenario of contact leading all the way back to Mars. It was a hypothesis. Now we have data, and more data is coming in, and more spacecraft data is coming in, and that's how I'm going to win my dinner from Hugh over here.
Very good. Well, Richard, I appreciate that. Let me go to Dave Flynn and give whatever his brief answer would like to be to that question.
It's kind of paradoxical. What the structures on Mars for me represent buildings by a entity that surpasses human power on order that we maybe surpass like an amoeba. But when they were initially designed, or actually what's intact in the design that I see is completely consonant with the messianic view of the Old Testament. In fact, the whole Old Testament, at least according to Jesus explaining it himself, was pointing to him. And when you look at the architecture of Cydonia, you invariably end up with motifs and geometry and numbers and things that say exactly the same thing as, well, a really good example is that idea that the face had two sides to it. That the Messiah has to come the first time, and then he has to suffer and die for sin as a man. But then as he comes the second time, he's the immortal ruler,
The lion.
The lion. And that's a real basic tenet of Christianity and Judaism, although there's a schism now. So what we see on Mars, I believe, was built by these entities before they rebelled. And a rebellion is a little bit different than a fall. Adam was corrupted by Lucifer. But Lucifer, on his own accord, looking at himself, decided he was going to be compared to God. So, paradoxically, he was the greatest revelator of God himself. But after he looked on himself as a alternative to God, then everything that you see that actually points to the Messiah in type, in typology, and in symbology ends up being turned around, just like Gnosticism does, and looks towards this God of this earth, which Satan is. So my view's actually pretty radical. And I established this very early, on my website. But at the same time, almost symbiotically, whenever Mr. Hoagland...
Would you stop calling me Mr. Hoagland?
All right, RCH looks at what I'm doing, he can see the merit in it because it's backing up the biblical text, but at the same time, it crosses over to the secular, it crosses over to the
I
other
don't
studies
agree
like
yet that David's model is on point at all. But I'm totally behind his search because he's an honest broker. He's looking where the data is leading. He's turning over rocks and looking underneath for things and pieces and parts of the puzzle that other people don't have the background to even begin to frame.
Well,
and
here's
what
the
we need
salient
are
part
honest
of that.
brokers in this game, not people who have, like the National Academy of Science, the view that certain questions can't ever be raised.
Where that all comes from, though, was not science. It was an a priori established idea that was the Bible is the inerrant Word of God, and I actually moved forward with that presupposition
So?
to actually find,
It's whatever
there's a
works.
commonality. Yeah, well, it ends up leading to the answers every time. Well, or at
But
least
you're an
on
honest
the
broker.
path. So I started with this belief that there's a objective reality in the Bible. And then I don't like to use the word Bible even. That's actually a Sidonian
Be
word because of
prepared
Biblos. Yeah.
to be surprised. Okay? Just
Well,
be prepared that it's not going to ultimately match what you think you're going to find, because for me, it certainly hasn't.
it's ended up actually reaffirming and confirming all the belief system I had to begin with, just through my first encounter with, the Creator in the form of Jesus.
But if you keep going, at some point you're going to find it's going to bother you. The
That's
things
such an
don't
interesting
fit.
point, because another part of my reason for being on the web and talking about these things is I can extend into eschatology, the science of what will be, the prophecies of the second coming. And surrounding that scenario is a great delusion that falls on the earth, a great lie that falls on the earth. Like I said, in the beginning, the conflict was, here's the greatest angel, revelator of the universe, turning on himself and saying, I will be compared to God. So everything that he does is it's actually a paradoxical sort of reversal of what he was designed to do. He'll use all the things that he was endowed with to focus on himself when he was actually originally designed to focus on the Messiah. So naturally, as you look at all these things that I think were designed by him and made by him, they'll end up being turned towards making men look at him as God, when that's actually the point of contention from the very beginning. And that's what the delusion's all about. I'm saying that this will add to it because there's so many people who don't understand that you can't divorce what you see in space and you see in science and you see all these other things around from the scripture. A lot of people have a very difficult time with that, even UFOs and their ideas, like Mike Heiser was talking about. If there's a UFO out there, maybe we should proselytize them. If there's people flying around out in space, maybe we should, pull them down and start preaching the gospel to them. Or maybe they're all just demons. Well, when you polarize yourself like that, you're not going to understand the issue very well.
Or maybe, as Pat Robertson said, we should stone them.
I appreciate that.
Right.
Let me go ahead and move the question on down the line. Thank you so much to David and Richard for that clarifying discussion there.
What was the specifics?
The
of the
specific question would
They
be
want to know where you live.
your faith or belief presuppositions that you're bringing to the table about who made us or what made us and why are humans here on this planet.
Well, okay, I'll try to be brief and non-elaborative here so we can move it on. I operate from some pretty simple presuppositions. I do believe there's a God. I think that is the most philosophically and scientifically coherent position. If you accept that there's a God, then there are things that go along with it. Like, if there's a God, can God actually do anything? I don't think it's a tall order for God to do things like influence people to write things down, i.e. the Bible, that get saved and circulated and transmitted for posterity. I think if God is able to create, he's certainly able to influence people to write something down. So given that set of presuppositions, we drift over into some of these areas. I don't feel terribly committed to any specific creationist model. The question I always ask myself is, what can the text sustain? I think what Dr. Ross is articulating can be sustained by the text. His view isn't the only one that can be sustained by the text. No view is perfect. There are always problem passages, and I look at things below the surface level in grammar and things like that, because if we really believe that the scriptures came from God, they're inspired, then it wasn't written in English, and so we need to comprehend it in the language in which it was written. And the language in which it was not written in a vacuum, so we need to incorporate our understanding of Israelite culture, religion, and that touches on the wider culture and religion. And there are similarities in Israelite religion and all ancient Near Eastern religions, and there are significant differences as well. And I think we need to incorporate all of that in our exegesis of the text. Sidonia, I'm intrigued. I mean, I more or less just have to suspend belief. I mean, it wouldn't bother me either way. I guess I'd probably be more disappointed if there was nothing there, but it's not like, I haven't invested the time that Richard has in it. If there is something there, I don't think theologically it's a problem, as you heard today, so I won't repeat that. So I'm conservative theologically. I'm a theist. I'm a creationist. But all those terms are subject to definition, and there's certain divergence in there as well.
Thank you so much. Let's go to Dr. Ross and then Dr. Nelson.
Okay, well, I serve not only as an astronomer, I've been a pastor in a church not far from Caltech since 1976. I'm pastoring a church that is conservative and evangelical. We believe in biblical inerrancy. The organization I helped found, Reasons to Believe, is predicated on the position that the evidence for the Christian faith and the inerrancy of Scripture will grow stronger and stronger as scientists learn more and more about the universe in which we live. The specific theological position I take is that God created Adam and Eve. I would date that roughly 40 to 50,000 years ago, based on the best calibrations I can make of the Genesis genealogies, and that Adam and Eve were in paradise, the best possible circumstance within the laws of physics. But Adam and Eve rebelled against God's authority, and he ejected them out into the world where they had to deal with the actual natural realm rather than the garden that he had planted and protected for them. And with their state of rebellion, they began to experience the consequences of their rebellion, namely more work and more pain in proportion to the sin and evil they allowed to come into their lives. God has sent his Son, the creator of the universe himself, Jesus Christ. And he died on the cross for all the sin and evil that we humans have committed. Anyone who wants to accept the offer of trading their imperfection for God's perfection can do that through the work of Christ on the cross. And that God is in the business now of bringing about a fairly rapid conquest of the problem of evil. As you heard me say in my talk, that would have to happen relatively quickly because the human species is headed for rapid extinction.
Did you want to put a date on that, Dr. Ross?
Well, I already did, because I calculated that the maximum longevity for our species, at least at a level of civilization and technology, must be briefer than 20,000 years. And we've been in that state for 10,000 years already. So that would give you a maximum window of 10,000 years. It wouldn't surprise me if it was a lot shorter than that.
All right.
And with that event...
He gave us a 2012 date in his chart, so I just wanted to check on that.
Sure. And with the final conquest of evil, then God will deliver us from this creation, deliver us from paradise, and we'll enter the new creation that God will build for us, and it will replace the current creation.
Thank
and I
you for
alluded
making
that the
clear.
ekpyrotic model might be consistent with that hypothesis.
And then Dr. Nelson.
I believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as made manifest in Jesus. And I guess the other half of the question was, why was man created? And I believe, as the Westminster Confession says, that man was, excuse me, human beings, not to be sexist, were created to glorify God and to enjoy him forever.
Thank you so much. A next question that comes theologically, addressed to Mike Heiser and Dr. Ross, is the question of interdimensions, or the Greek term heavenlies, the idea appearing to be plural in the Greek text, and I think it's the same in the Hebrew text, that the word heavens is a plural term in the Hebrew text. And so the questioner is asking, are these multiple dimensions the place where God and other non-material beings live? Is that the location of heaven? And this question was addressed to Michael Heiser and Hugh Ross.
Heavenlies as a term, Hebrew Shemayim, can refer to heavenly beings. The way we know that is sometimes that term will be used in parallelism, in poetic parallelism to words like angels or holy ones, kedoshim. So sometimes it refers to beings. Sometimes, of course, it just refers to, for lack of a better term, the heavens. And I think it can be said that it encompasses all the layers of heaven. In the Second Temple period, which is the intertestamental period, after the Old Testament ends, before the New Testament begins, it was very common for Jewish scholars to exegete those passages and actually have different compartments, different layers, different concentric circles of heaven, either at the center of which or at the top of which was the domain of God. Again, I don't know if that is the best exegesis. I don't think it can be precluded by anything in the text or any of the grammar or anything like that. So they're not sucking it out of their thumb. It's just, I would put that as a possible way to look at things. But the dimensional question, I think, is better left for Dr. Ross.
Thank you. Dr. Ross?
Okay, the interdimensional hypothesis, I think, was first attributed to Jacques Vallée. He wrote about it about 20 years ago, and then has been talking about string theory as being consistent with that. Physicists would look at the 10 space-time dimensions as being a consistent whole along which the matter and energy of the universe would operate. And so we don't conceive of dimensions between the 10 space-time dimensions. However, I think if you were to rephrase Jacques Vallée's terminology and talk about transdimensionality, that would certainly be consistent with the Christian model that I'm proposing, that there would be angelic beings, and God, of course, would transcend the 10 space-time dimensions. As far as heaven and hell are concerned, the new creation in the last 2 chapters of the Bible is a place where there is temporal experiences going on, and there's some kind of geography. But since it's a new creation that replaces this creation, it's completely independent outside of the space-time dimensions of this universe. So it's a different kind of geography, a different kind of temporality. In fact, I believe it's a temporality and a geography that's going to lift the restraints that this physics and this space-time dimensions put on our capacity to relate to one another. In a new creation, it talks about there will be no marriage, no families, no sexual intercourse. All that will be replaced by something far superior, where we're going to have a unity with one another that's impossible given the laws of physics that we experience here. And in particular, the space-time dimensions that structure this universe simply wouldn't permit the relational experiences that we see described in the new creation. So it's going to be something far grander.
I appreciate
than what
that.
space and time would permit.
Let me follow that, Dr. Ross, with a question that came in numerous times for yourself, asking, is it possible that some sort of a mechanism for rapid travel through space, or it's 2 questions that came in for you. One was asking, could something like that have come from another dimension, the idea of possibly parallel universes? Could there be methods of traveling rapidly that we are unaware of now that may appear, as Arthur C. Clarke said, any advanced technology would appear to be magic? Is it possible that something like that could come from another dimension? The parallel question that was being asked to you is now escaping me, so I'm going to let you answer that one.
Well, I address this in some detail in Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, also in our DVD, the RUFO hypothesis, that, you heard me talk about the limits on space travel by physical intelligent aliens based on the speed of light. There are those that speculate that maybe we could travel through wormholes.
Yes.
And so I've got a section in both the video and the book that deal with that.
Could you summarize your response to that?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. In a black hole, you have a singularity. And if you can line up the singularity of one black hole with the singularity of a second black hole, that would permit, theoretically, a shortcut from one space-time realm to another space-time realm. And you see this exploited in a number of, I think Babylon 5 on TV has that idea. Now, the physicist's response is the probability of getting the singularity of one black hole to perfectly line up with the singularity of a second black hole is vanishingly small. Moreover, we realize that the dimensions of the tube that would connect one black hole horizon with another black hole horizon is so exceptionally small, it will not permit the passage of even the tiniest physical entity. So even an electron would not be capable of passing through it. Now, mathematically, there is a possibility that this could be set up, but it's impossible for any physical object to move from the mouth of one black hole and exit the mouth of the other black hole. So as attractive as it is for Babylon 5, it is physically impossible if we're talking about beings that really are confined to the laws of physics and the 10 space-time dimensions of the universe.
Thank you very much. My next question is directed to you, Richard. Did you want to bring in a comment
I wanted
first?
to add kind of an interesting footnote. This gentleman on the screen is James Clerk Maxwell, who, as of course you knows, and a lot of other people know, is one of the founding fathers of physics. It's Maxwell who gave us the infamous Maxwell equations, which describe electromagnetic propagation of radiation through 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. What most people are not aware of is that a couple, 3 years ago, we found some poetry that Maxwell wrote as he was pursuing the famous equations. And I've actually got a couple examples here because, of all things, we find that Maxwell was a multi-dimensional theorist. For instance, he said, "O wretched race of men, to space confined, what honor can ye pay to him whose mind to that which lies beyond hath penetrated? The symbols he hath formed shall sound his praise, and lead him on through unimagined ways to conquests new in worlds not yet created. First ye determinants in ordered row, and massive column ranged before him go, to form a phalanx for his safe protection. Yet powers of the nth roots of -1 around his head in ceaseless cycles run as unembodied spirits of direction." Here's the punchline. "And you, ye undevelopable scrolls, above the host wave your emblazoned rolls, ruled for the record of his bright inventions. Ye cubic surfaces, by 3s and 9s, draw round his camp your 27 lines, the seal of Solomon in 3 dimensions." In other words, this is the famous 27 lines in the general cubic surface, hyperdimensional equations over a century old, that in this classic poem to Arthur Cayley, who was a geometer of higher dimensions over 100 years ago, Maxwell finished, "March on, symbolic host, with steps sublime, up to the flaming bounds of space and time, there pause, until by Dickinson depicted, in 2 dimensions we the form may trace of him whose soul, too large for vulgar space, in n dimensions flourished unrestricted." This is a physicist who is the cornerstone of modern physics, and his work was suborned by Heaviside, and it was originally 20 equations written in quaternions, which is a 4-dimensional mathematical language that has been, shall we say, diminished.
Well, George Riemann was the one that pointed out that if you invoke higher dimensions, math actually becomes easier in some physical applications than in 3.
I
1,
did
2, and
not
3.
know of Maxwell's hyperdimensional predilections until we found the geometry of Sidonia. And the geometry of Sidonia is the geometry of Cayley, of Plate, of Maxwell. It's an n-dimensional space geometry, and that's why I think we're definitely onto something, and I'm looking forward to dinner.
And Richard, that leads to the next question that many people asked about the former face that existed in New Hampshire, and their question repeated throughout this stack is, what tells you with a degree of certainty that the face and the other artifacts here are any more special than the face that was in New Hampshire?
Got an hour?
I wish that we did.
It's really simple. In fact, it comes down to dimensions. The face at Franconia Notch, and when we were kids, my parents used to take us to New Hampshire, and we would go and we'd stand in that parking lot and we'd look at this craggy granite visage. It was a 2-dimensional illusion. If you moved 50 feet to the left or the right, it went away. It was a projection from one observation spot. The face on Mars, as Mark Carlotto did mathematically and Kinthea did the hard way in clay, is a 3-dimensional full facial construct. It has forehead, chin, nose, eyebrows, eye sockets, a platform, symmetry, even species identification, the famous hominid feline things that David and I agree on, that I spoke of at the UN 10 years ago. There is zero comparison.
And go ahead
Zero
then and explain
comparison.
to us the numbers and the hyperdimensional physics of what we're seeing.
What we've done here, and we started, like 20 years ago, is identify these curious morphologies. And what we found is that there are alignments and linkages between these objects that are billions to one against chance, if you want to pull out big numbers, Hugh. And the numbers have been done not by me, but by people like Horace Crater, who was the head of the Space Science Lab at the University of Tennessee, and by McDaniel and others. And they are an internally consistent mathematics. In other words, 19.5 is the so-called circumscribed tetrahedral angle. That number is, in fact, the same numbers that we see over and over again all across Cydonia, linked to tetrahedral objects. And those objects seem to be actual representations of this higher dimensional gateway between dimensions that is part of the Cayley and Riemann mathematics that leads to other state spaces. And that's why I'm more than convinced that we're definitely looking at a real science, that we're looking at a complex whose purpose, David may be right about. It may be that no one ever lived here. It may be that the only reason why this was designed was to give us this message, which is human beings, as Maxwell said, are not ultimately confined to 3 dimensions. And if that's the message, if that's the reason that stuff is there, it's the most extraordinary message in the history of the human species, because it's liberating to the ultimate degree. It means that with appropriate knowledge and technology, the human species has no endpoint, and his, death sentence of another 10,000 years is meaningless.
Now, Richard, that brings me to a very important question for Dave Flynn, because what Dave Flynn was describing for us and showed us the year 2012 on his chart is a series of cycles of extinction and what might be termed recreation. And David, I'd appreciate it if you would comment a little bit further on what you're hearing.
Well, I don't know if anybody's heard of the Temple of Edfu in Egypt. It talks about the artificers of Horus, the metallurgers, these beings that came down with the elder gods who created megalithic sites all over the world. And this is, from the Egyptian texts in Edfu that were translated in 1870. And what this is addressing is this idea that this race came before a flood. It was talking about a time before, of course, the Hellenistic era that was intact at the time they actually built this temple, but it goes way, way back before even the Pleistocene era, 13,000 years ago, at the end of the Pleistocene. And they were predicting, these gods were predicting that the world would be destroyed and that they were trying to create some sort of system by which, after this flood, they would be able to somehow in the future resurrect their golden age and resurrect the knowledge that they'd imparted to humanity. And so to answer this question then, I think that we're at the point in time now where that Zep Tepi that the Egyptians were talking about that first time is happening again. And consonant with that is an insertion into our dimension, a manifestation on a grand scale of extraterrestrial entity. So what I'm saying is, along with this event, I think that the hand of this angelic realm is going to manifest again, so that you can't really deny what's going on Mars, and you can't deny the UFO manifestations on this Earth, because it'll expand to a level that's so great you can't ignore it.
Now, Doug, what's really weird, and I mean, David and I have not shared anything on this. In fact, it was eerie how our 2 presentations today tracked so intriguingly, given that we haven't really talked about any of this. There's been no time. What we have found from the hyperdimensional direction, going back to the geometry at Cydonia, the Maxwell-Riemann higher dimensional connections, is that we're looking at the same disjuncture. There's something coming in the physics which has precipitated terrestrial catastrophes in the past and will precipitate another series in the future. And what's really interesting is that the same symbology you're finding in this mythological record seems to encode this warning. It happened before, it will happen again, and here's what you should watch for. I've had a question posed to this gentleman for the last several weeks. I've said, what famous film dealing with this symbology is essentially trying to communicate the same message that David has found in the mythologies going back to Sumer? And he has been grappling with this for several weeks now. Mike knows the answer.
Would you like to
So-
enlighten us now, Richard?
You want to take one more stab at it?
It's been almost like 2 months now. I
Okay.
think I'll get it.
Well, he showed you a slide that there is this double-faced entity in the Sumerian and the Assyrian, Nergal, that represents Mars. We have a double-faced image at Sidonia, the face on Mars. Lion, hominid, same lineage, same iconography. The film is 2001. The symbology is David Bowman, who is Sagittarius, who is Nergal, who is Mars.
We'll all have to watch that again now.
Yeah, I'll have to watch
Thank you very much, Richard. I have another question now for Dr. Nelson, Dr. Paul Nelson. You have talked about SETI and the work of SETI to look for signals coming to the Earth from outside the Earth. You mentioned in your talk that there was one anomalous signal in SETI's history, and one question was about that anomalous signal. Can you comment any more about that?
In the SETI literature, it's called the WOW, W-O-W, exclamation point event. It was recorded in 1977. If I don't have the precise radio telescope on which it came in.
John Krause, University of Ohio.
Never repeated, but it showed the narrowband pattern that they were looking for. The problem was when they looked again, they couldn't find it. So, and as the characteristic of singleton observations, they get your curiosity up, but you want more than that.
We need confirmation.
You need confirmation. So
Here's a further follow-up question then. It has been suggested by numerous participants in SETI that they expand their approaches to their question beyond simply the use of radio telescopes and begin taking in and evaluating photographic data and other forms of data, and I wondered if you would concur with that or have any comments on that.
well, you still have to know what you're looking for. No one tries to detect something and just throws their net absolutely wide open. You still have to focus on particular kinds of patterns and say, these are the ones that it would be likely an alien intelligence would be trying to send to us. The reason for focusing on that particular frequency that I showed you in the slide from the SETI at Home project is it's the spectrum of hydrogen. And it's thought that an alien intelligence would understand the molecular composition of matter, and that this would be a good place to locate a signal if anybody else was looking. But of course, what if these intelligences, should there be any, have a completely different set of presuppositions? We may be being bathed right now in their signals. It's just that we're not looking for them. We haven't set up our detectors in the right way. So sure, look in lots of different ways, but you can't look willy-nilly. You've got to have some kind of rationale for trying to detect.
See, if Sidonia is real, I don't think SETI is going to ever show us anything. And
That
the reason-
raises a question, Richard, that was posed very wisely. Why is NASA apparently willing now to support SETI and accept the possibility that SETI will produce a positive hit when it is your opinion that NASA is opposed to you getting a
Yeah,
positive hit?
they are now getting
They
federal
are getting
funding.
back into federal funding?
Yes.
Okay.
And NASA's always wanted that money, but Congress has turned them down.
Well,
but
Proxmire,
Congress, yeah,
you know,
Proxmire killed
was
it.
the guy who killed it.
but they are now back in the federal budget. And just to complete what you're saying there, in terms of where you look for these signals, you want to look in places where galactic and intergalactic noise is at a minimal level. That's one of the reasons why they've chosen what they call the water hole, the space between the hydrogen emission and the OH emission, because it's the water molecule, but also it's that part of the electromagnetic spectrum where you got very low background noise, and therefore a much higher probability of detecting a signal. And if they're more advanced than we are, they're going to figure out that sending us a signal where the noise is low is a good idea. And I think we also need to take into account that we're on the verge of the technology of finding planets that would have the chemical signature which would allow for the support of life. Therefore, they're a little bit more advanced than we are, just a little bit more advanced. They'll already know that Earth is a place where you want to target your signal.
Next question is addressed to Hugh Ross. The anomalous occurrences such as crop circles, the UFOs that are reported, abductions that are reported, those sorts of anomalous occurrences. This question came up, addressed to you a number of times in my stack, of asking how would you explain that anomalous data?
Well, you'll see it described in some detail in both the book and the DVD. Is that, I was processing UFO reports ever since I was 16, mainly because we made the mistake of having our astronomy club booth right next door to the Flying Saucer Club booth. So that's how I got started.
Serendipity.
But as an astronomer, I noted that about 99% of what people would report to me as UFOs, I could explain as some natural event or some human-induced thing, military aircraft, or much more common, an engineering student prank. But there's a 1% residual. My experience as a pastor is quite different. About 90% of what people report to me, I can see a human or natural explanation, and a 10% residual. And maybe that reflects the fact that certain UFO observers will go to an astronomer, others will go to a pastor. So maybe that explains the different statistics you get. But when you look at the residual, what I discover is that they consistently violate the laws of physics. To give you some examples, which I record in my book, is that observers would report these things moving at 18,000 miles an hour through the atmosphere, making a sharp right angle turn, or making a sudden stop. Well, physical objects cannot sustain those kinds of forces without being destroyed.
Under current physics.
I'm admitting all that. What we see in the residual UFO database is that they're not physical objects. When they crash into the Earth, there's no debris. When they go through the atmosphere at 25,000 miles an hour, there's no sonic boom. When they hover above the Earth, there's no movement of air. This is not what we would see from physical objects subject to the laws of physics. On the other hand, we devote a chapter to showing that there are actual physical effects from these residual UFO experiences. You see dogs and cows disturbed before the human observer is disturbed. You notice that grass will be burnt. One of the more amazing examples, what you see out of France, is that you'll see leaves damaged where it looks like it's some radiation effect, but it doesn't correspond to microwave or nuclear radiation. It's something that's clearly looks like damage, but it's nothing that we can attribute to radiation phenomena that we know and understand.
How do you explain this phenomenon?
Well, one of the things that kind of led me to write the book is that these things statistically have the highest probability of being spotted at 3 a.m. in the morning. Against all other times. It's really kind of a spike you get at 3 a.m. in the morning. The other thing is the geography. The most common location are lonely country roads. Not desolate fields where there are no roads, not cities or towns, but these lonely country roads. Well, guess who hangs out at 3 a.m. in the morning at lonely country roads? Astronomers do. And yet astronomers seldom have these residual UFO experiences. They're kind of at the bottom of the list of the observers. Although I personally know of 2 astronomers that have had several these residual UFO encounters. And this goes back all the way to the late 60s. And it's actually reported well in the UFO literature. But I know these astronomers, and when I was a graduate student having this observation, there were 3 of us as graduate students that were logging 1,500 observing hours a year. These guys were logging 3 or 4 hours per year. And so this is kind of a joke in the astronomy department. How come these people who log all this time never see anything, and these guys who log so little time consistently have their experiences? I was a fairly new Christian at the time and recognized that these two were different from the rest of us. They were deeply involved in occult activity. And those of us that were logging 1,500 hours plus per year were not involved in that. So from that point onward, I asked myself the question, is there a correlation between the individual's occult experiences and background and their propensity to have these residual UFO encounters? And that has proved consistent ever since 1969. The other thing that I think supports that is that speaking about this overseas, I had a chance to go to Russia in the Soviet era, and I was asked to speak on UFOs at different physics departments in Russia. And Russia's a place where there's a lot more occult activity than here. In fact, back in the Soviet era, it was typical for every department of physics at a major university to have a department of occult physics. It's the only spiritual activity that the Soviet government would permit. So having a seance, bringing out a Ouija board, astrological forecasts. I've got a chapter in here where I make a list of things that people have commonly fingered as occult activities. But I think the real kicker, and this is my last chapter, if you take steps to break your links with your occult past, that will put an end to your residual UFO experiences. So we close the book off by saying we're offering a testable hypothesis, is that you can demonstrate whether our explanation for UFOs is right or wrong by simply putting this to the test. One test, is there a correlation between the population's occult involvement and the propensity to see residual UFOs? I think that's definitely in the database. And number 2, if individuals take steps to close their links, does that put an end to their experiences? So in that sense, I'd invite anyone to put our model to the test.
My next question then is addressed to David Flynn. David Flynn, the question has been raised a couple of times today about crop circles, and the question for you is, do you see any relationship between the phenomenon of crop circles and Cydonia?
Well, there's been some really excellent work done by a man named David Percy. I think it was 91. He actually took a map of Cydonia, I think it was the eastern half, where there's the Tholus, I don't have a picture of it,
Yep.
and the crater with the tetrahedral pyramid on the edge. Then there's also the big wall. The cliff. And he superimposed this over the Avebury area, the Avebury-Silbury Hill area, and shrunk down the Cydonia area and found almost an exact match. And a little while ago, I wrote to Colin Andrews and asked him if it was something consistent with his data, if he found that the crop circle phenomena, the ones that were bona fide, the ones that he actually could qualify as being the phenomena and not some hoax or not man-made, occurred in a certain area in England. And he said, definitely, the ones he has studied or was aware of all ended up in the Wiltshire area, exactly where this facsimile of Cydonia exists.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, Richard.
One of the models that we've entertained, going back, the 20 years that I've been looking at the Mars problem, has been that we're dealing with some designer. Mike and I have discussed this at some length. If the face on Mars is a monument to meddling in the nursery from some extraterrestrial species that in the Clark model, 2001, basically we had a little help. The question then becomes, how much help is a little? Is it conceivable that this place was, shall we say, remodeled into a system much more friendly for our kind of life by an agent lower than God, higher than humanity, and maybe at the level of the angels, but not a non-corporeal intelligence, but another species, one of many that were originated in some unknown fashion. Your model is that we're it. We're the highest pinnacle of creation. The earth is the nursery, carefully, lovingly prepared.
I'm open to other possibilities, Richard, but I see that as probably the most theologically consistent, but as I mentioned...
I'm not going to quibble.
Yeah,
What
right.
I want to do
I do see
is
other options.
is to ask some implications stemming from the model. Let's assume we're it, all right? What's to forbid? And there used to be an old maxim in physics, that which is not forbidden is permitted, meaning that if there isn't a law that says you can't do it something absolutely, given enough time, it'll happen. Somewhere, someplace, somehow it'll happen. If we're it, and I think you put a 50,000-year figure on Adam and Eve,
Right.
something like that? Okay. 50,000 years is a hell of a long time. Can you say hell of a long time in a biblical conference? Anyway, Sumer is 6,000 years, and it got lost from memory. If it hadn't been for the guy Woolsey and those guys, we wouldn't know that we had this incredible antecedent, which actually was more stunning than, in some ways, than Egypt, which left a lot of big stone stuff. What's to prevent human beings in that 50,000 years from having developed a really extraordinary capability? Gone to Mars, gone to the whole solar system, colonized every place, hung out on the moon, put satellite colonies on Mercury, hung out at Titan, put things in the rings of Saturn. Then you had the fall. We devolved to this place, and we're looking at all that stuff out there that's our stuff. I mean, it's the fall. And that has been coming down to us as a distorted echo of a reality that we now can actually physically go and verify, test, dig a spade and find the libraries, for God's sake.
Yeah, I'd be open to that possibility. I mean, I'm not warm to it because my
But
Christian...
it's getting fuzzier.
No, my biblical perspective is that God is doing the experiment once and only once. He created Adam and Eve, and
But is there not redemption?
There is redemption.
Okay, so you start here, we louse it up, and then we are redeemed. But why does the process have to be linear?
Okay, but the biblical perspective that I stated when I was asked to state my position is that God creates his universe. One of the purposes of it is to provide this vehicle or theater for the conquest of evil. And when evil is conquered, he takes us to a brand new universe. So it's not a restoration theology, it's a replacement theology.
Richard,
When I
I'd like to follow that
evil
up.
seemed to be winning.
Well, hold it. In terms of Sidonia, I mean, one of the constraints we can put on that is that there's geological evidence that the structure is old. Given how old those structures are...
What's the evidence?
Pardon me?
What's the evidence?
Well, we can see rills there, we can see erosion.
But do you know the rates of erosion? Do you
well-
really know the atmosphere of Mars?
If you want to know, I can ask my friends at JPL just what
No.
kind of erosion
No,
dates
don't
they
ask
got.
those guys.
Well, pick any NASA.
I want an independent, impartial.
Well, we could get that, but I mean, you can see, based on your own photographs that you showed, that there's a rill running through it. You can
Isn't
see...
that a Redford movie?
Pardon me?
Isn't that a Redford movie?
No, let me get to the bottom line here, because time is valuable here, is that given the age of the Sidonia structure, based on the geological erosion evidence we see there and the rill structures, wouldn't that rule out the possibility that there's been a recent building of that structure? And if it's not recent, then don't we run into the time constraint that the universe provides, the anthropic principle in equality, which states that there's a minimum time necessary for the physics of the universe to even permit the existence of an extraterrestrial intelligent society.
No,
So
if this is the human race, it's just kind of a part of the family we didn't know we had, how does that
Now, if we're talking
contravene
an
your-
angelic species, I'd be open to that. But if we're talking species that's confined to physics and the space-time dimensions as we are,
Yes.
then there's a certain minimum time necessary for them to come upon the scene.
Wait. Arthur Clarke years ago proposed a space elevator, a 22,300-mile fiber of unobtainium that would extend from the Earth's surface up to geosynchronous orbit. There are folks not far from me at Los Alamos that recently had a conference on how to build the damn thing out of carbon fiber nanotubes. The technology has caught up with Arthur. Now, what they don't know, what's the real surprise, and I'm going to go on coast and talk about, is how the hyperdimensional physics will kill them dead if they ever build this thing. And the reason is what happened to the tether.